hidden behind the thick stone walls of medieval monasteries, were not just prayers, devotion, and sacred rituals, but something far darker. Imagine walking through a candlelit corridor, the smell of incense masking something rotten beneath, a place where silence was law, but secrets screamed from within. We often think of monasteries as sanctuaries of peace, holy retreats where men and women renounced worldly desires to serve God. But what if those sacred walls also concealed obsession, fear, and human corruption? What if the monasteries, those symbols of purity, became laboratories for twisted experiments on the human soul, and sometimes the body? From the flagellants who whipped themselves bloody to cleanse their sins, to the bizarre punishments designed to purify temptation, to the secret libraries where forbidden texts on alchemy, demonology, and medicine were hidden beneath prayers. The truth about medieval monastic life is far more complex than the stories we were told. These were not simply places of holiness. They were worlds within worlds, microcosms of medieval society filled with power struggles, human frailty, and occasionally, madness. Music deepens. A low hum of monks chanting in Latin blends with the sound of a turning page. In this episode, we journey into the shadowed corridors of faith and fanaticism, uncovering the twisted practices of medieval monasteries. What did they do in the name of salvation? What was the line between devotion and delusion? And what does this reveal about the dark side of human nature itself? To understand the strange practices that took place within medieval monasteries, we first need to understand the world that created them. A world ruled by faith, fear, and a constant war, not on the battlefield, but inside the human soul. The rise of the monasteries. Between the 5th and 15th centuries, Europe was a continent transformed by religion. The fall of the Roman Empire left chaos in its wake. Political power fractured, kingdoms rose and fell, and the plague of ignorance spread through the ruins of civilization. Into this darkness stepped the monastery, a beacon of order and devotion. The first monastic rules were established by Saint Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century. His rule of Saint Benedict became the cornerstone of Western monastic life, a strict code of obedience, poverty, and chastity. But these were not mere guidelines. They were a total surrender of the self. Monks and nuns were required to abandon their families, possessions, and even their names, becoming instruments of divine will. Their days were carved into cycles of prayer, labor, and silence. Every action, from eating to sleeping, was an act of discipline, designed to conquer the body and elevate the spirit. To outsiders, these places seemed holy, sanctuaries of purity in a sinful world. But within those walls, human nature did not vanish. It transformed. The psychology of isolation. Modern psychologists studying monastic records have noted a recurring theme: the psychological strain of isolation and repression. For many monks, silence was more than a vow, it was a test of sanity. Living for decades without laughter, conversation, or freedom often led to hallucinations, paranoia, and mystical experiences that blurred the line between divine vision and mental collapse. Some monks claimed to see angels or demons. Others wrote of nightly temptations, where Satan himself appeared in human form. To resist such visions, many resorted to extreme self-punishment, fasting, flagellation, or wearing spiked garments that tore into their flesh. These weren't isolated acts of fanaticism. They were institutionalized, encouraged, even celebrated as signs of holiness. Knowledge hidden in the shadows. But monasteries weren't just places of prayer and pain. They were also repositories of knowledge. The last fortresses of learning in a world that had largely forgotten how to read. Inside their libraries, monks painstakingly copied manuscripts by candlelight, religious texts, medical treatises, and works of ancient philosophy. Without these scribes, the knowledge of Aristotle, Galen, and Euclid might have vanished forever. Yet, not all texts they copied were holy. Some monasteries, especially in the later Middle Ages, became secret laboratories for forbidden knowledge. Alchemy, astrology, herbal medicine, and even proto-scientific experiments were conducted under the guise of spiritual study. In the monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy, scholars translated Arabic manuscripts filled with ideas from the Islamic Golden Age, blending faith with reason, mysticism with medicine. Elsewhere, the line between divine revelation and heresy grew dangerously thin. A monk could be a healer, or an occultist, a theologian, or a heretic. The difference depended on who was watching. The corruption of power. By the 13th century, monasteries had become immensely wealthy. Kings and nobles donated vast lands and treasures in exchange for prayers and salvation. But with wealth came corruption. Abbeys that once vowed poverty now owned vineyards, mills, and armies of servants. Some monks lived like lords, feasting on roasted meat and fine wine, while peasants starved outside their gates. Documents from the Cistercian order reveal monks caught in gambling, secret affairs, and even violent feuds with rival abbeys. And yet, the greatest scandals were not always material. They were spiritual. Many monastic orders began to enforce ever harsher disciplines, seeking to restore purity through suffering. In some cases, this obsession with control led to cruel psychological experiments, forcing monks to endure weeks without sleep or isolating novices in darkness to test their faith. To the medieval mind, pain purified, suffering revealed truth, and the body was merely the cage that held the soul. The gender divide. Women behind walls. While male monasteries gained power, female convents faced an even more complex reality. For many women, the convent was both a prison and a refuge, a place to escape forced marriage or live a life of learning and autonomy denied to them elsewhere. Yet nuns, too, were caught between piety and persecution. Records from 14th century Germany describe cases where women who experienced mystical trances were accused of possession or witchcraft. Visions that once symbolized divine grace became, in the eyes of church officials, signs of demonic interference. In some convents, abbesses were reported to wield near-absolute authority, even establishing secret penance chambers for wayward sisters. Punishments ranged from fasting and isolation to physical restraint and public humiliation. Faith as fear, devotion as control. By the late Middle Ages, Europe was trapped between devotion and terror. The Black Death swept across the continent, killing millions and shattering faith in divine mercy. In response, movements like the flagellants arose. Groups of monks and laymen who traveled from town to town, beating themselves bloody in front of crowds, believing their pain could atone for humanity's sins. To modern eyes, it seems barbaric, but to them, it was the ultimate expression of faith, a way to force God to listen. And that, perhaps, is the heart of the medieval monastery's darkness. It was not born of evil, but of desperation, a desperate attempt to control sin, suffering, and salvation in a world they didn't understand. Faith, knowledge, fear, and madness, all intertwined behind stone walls. But what did these practices look like, day to day? What was it truly like to live inside one of these twisted sanctuaries? In the next part, we step into the shadows of their rituals. To walk inside a medieval monastery was to step into another world, a world ruled by ritual, silence, and control. But beneath the surface of devotion lay practices that were meant to break the body and reshape the mind. These weren't acts of cruelty for cruelty's sake. They were the reflection of an idea, that suffering was sacred, that pain was a language God could understand. The discipline of flesh. Monastic life revolved around discipline, a constant war between the desires of the body and the purity of the soul. To conquer one's flesh, monks developed rituals of self-punishment known as mortificatio corporis, the mortification of the flesh. Imagine this. Before dawn, a group of monks kneel in the cold chapel. The air bites their skin as they strike their own backs with braided cords. Each lash meant to drive out temptation. Blood mixes with the scent of candle wax and myrrh. No one cries out. No one speaks. The sound of the whip becomes a kind of prayer. Flagellation was considered a spiritual weapon, a way to share in the suffering of Christ. Some monasteries even had designated discipline rooms, where monks could perform these rituals in private or, at times, under supervision. Historical records from the 13th century mention monks in Germany who whipped themselves daily until they fainted, believing the pain brought them closer to divine truth. But this obsession with punishment did not stop at the skin. The art of silence and psychol. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasized silence as one of the highest virtues. To speak was to risk sin, pride, gossip, temptation. In many monasteries, days or even weeks would pass without a single word. Monks communicated only through gestures, raising a hand to ask for bread, bowing to ask forgiveness. At first, silence seems peaceful, but over time, it became a tool of control. Imagine a young novice, only 16 years old, entering a monastery for the first time. He's forbidden to speak, forbidden to look directly at others. Every mistake, a broken cup, a moment of laughter, is recorded by a senior monk. His world shrinks to ritual and obedience. After months of isolation, he begins to dream vividly, to hear things at night, whispers in the dark corridors, footsteps where no one walks. To the church, such experiences might be seen as visions, a soul being purified. But to modern psychologists, they mirror sensory deprivation and psychological breakdown. The monastery, intentionally or not, became a kind of laboratory, testing how far the human spirit could bend before it broke. Strange rituals of purity. One of the strangest practices of medieval monasticism was the obsession with temptation. The church taught that even a single lustful thought could endanger the soul. So monks devised rituals to purge desire, often bizarre, sometimes terrifying. Some wore spiked belts beneath their robes, called cilices, small metal chains with inward-facing barbs that dug into their skin whenever they moved. Others slept on cold stone floors or wore coarse wool that constantly irritated their flesh. There are accounts of monks covering themselves in nettles or rolling in snow to extinguish carnal thoughts. In one 12th century chronicle, a monk confessed to throwing himself into a frozen river every time he felt temptation, believing that if his body froze, his soul might thaw. These acts weren't considered madness. They were sanctified. The monastery believed that pain could burn away sin, that by punishing the flesh, one purified the soul. It was a theology of extremes, salvation through suffering, purity through pain. The midnight rituals. Life in a monastery was governed by time, not the sun, but the bell. The monks rose in the dead of night to chant the matins, prayers that often lasted for hours. The atmosphere during these vigils was haunting. Imagine standing in a vast candle-lit hall, shadows dancing across the arches, the air thick with incense and exhaustion. The chanting drones on in Latin, repetitive and hypnotic, echoing against the stone. Sleep deprivation was a constant companion. Some historians believe this was intentional, that fatigue was used to induce visions, breaking down the barriers between the physical and spiritual worlds. In some monastic writings, monks describe encountering strange presences during these vigils, angelic beings, or in darker accounts, demonic shapes hovering between candle flames. Were these hallucinations, or did centuries of belief give birth to something else? Forbidden curiosity. The secret studies. Despite their vows of obedience, curiosity burned in many monastic minds. Beneath the monasteries of Europe, in catacombs and hidden chambers, monks stored manuscripts that were never meant to be read aloud, texts on alchemy, astrology, and pagan philosophy, hidden among the Psalms and Gospels. One such discovery occurred at the monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland, where scribes copied ancient Greek and Arabic works that explored not only medicine, but the nature of the soul itself. These monks believed that by understanding creation, they could understand the Creator. But the Church saw danger in knowledge, especially knowledge that blurred the line between science and sorcery. Some monasteries were raided, their libraries burned, their scholars branded heretics. Others continued their studies in silence, encoding forbidden wisdom within illuminated manuscripts. If you look closely at certain medieval texts, symbols of alchemy are woven into the margins, disguised as floral decorations or celestial charts. They were hidden sciences in plain sight, recorded by men who feared both God and the Inquisition. The death cells. Among the most chilling practices were the death cells. When a monk was believed to have committed an unpardonable sin, he might be sealed within a small room, barely large enough to kneel. Food would be passed through a hole once a day. He could pray, but never speak or see another face again. Some were kept there for weeks, others until they died. The idea was simple. If the body must perish for the soul to be saved, then so be it. In the ruins of old monasteries, archaeologists have found small sealed chambers beside chapels, with crosses scratched into the walls and bones lying where the monks last prayed. They weren't buried, because in a way, they were buried alive. These rituals might seem horrifying to us now, but they reveal something deeply human, our need to control the uncontrollable. To make sense of pain, to find meaning in suffering. But not all agreed with this darkness. Even within the Church, voices rose, questioning the cruelty, the excess, the fanaticism. In the next part, we'll explore the controversies that shook these sacred walls, and how science, heresy, and rebellion began to unravel the twisted web of medieval monastic life. By the late Middle Ages, cracks began to appear in the stone walls of Europe's monasteries, not just physical ones, but moral and intellectual. What had once been a fortress of faith began to divide under the weight of its own contradictions. The rebellion. Within for centuries, monks had been told that obedience was the highest virtue. To question authority was to question God himself. But by the 13th and 14th centuries, new thinkers began to ask dangerous questions. Why must holiness require pain? Why must silence mean truth? And why did God's house grow rich while his people starved? Among these dissenters were men like John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia, theologians who dared to speak against the excesses of the Church. They criticized the monasteries for their greed, hypocrisy, and moral decay. Wycliffe wrote that Christ had no property, no servants, no silver chalices, yet his followers dine in gold. These voices were met with fury. Many were branded heretics, their writings burned. Hus was executed by fire in 1415, his ashes thrown into the Rhine River. Yet their message spread like wildfire. The idea that one could serve God without the monastery, that faith could be personal, direct, and unmediated, marked the beginning of a revolution that would soon reshape Europe forever. The scandals of the cloister. The more the Church tried to hide its flaws, the more they leaked into daylight. Documents from the Vatican archives describe cases of corruption, sexual misconduct, and even murder within certain monastic orders. Some monasteries, particularly wealthy Benedictine abbeys, became centers of indulgence rather than piety. Reports tell of monks who drank wine until dawn, hosted lavish feasts, and maintained secret liaisons with women from nearby villages. In France, one abbot was famously accused of keeping a private harem within the monastery walls, defended under the claim of spiritual comfort. But even darker were the spiritual manipulations, confessions twisted into power, penance used as punishment, faith turned into fear. One 15th-century nun wrote in her diary of being locked in a cold cell for 3 weeks because she spoke too warmly of a vision of Christ. Another described her abbess demanding public self-flagellation for any who dared question her authority. It became clear that in some monasteries, the line between discipline and domination had long been erased. The forbidden sciences and the Church's paradox. While the Church condemned heresy, it also depended on the monastery's scholars. Monks were still the guardians of knowledge, and that made them dangerous. Hidden in the shadows, some began to experiment with ideas that defied doctrine. At the Abbey of Reichenau, monks observed the stars and charted celestial movements centuries before Galileo. At Mont Saint-Michel, alchemical manuscripts detailed strange experiments, blending theology with proto-chemistry. And in Chartres Cathedral, scholars studied the harmony of mathematics and creation, a philosophy later whispered to have inspired secret societies. But to the Church, this curiosity flirted with blasphemy. Those who probed too deeply were accused of consorting with the devil. One monk, Roger Bacon, a 13th-century English scholar, was imprisoned for years because his studies of optics and mathematics were deemed demonic. Ironically, his experiments would later form the foundations of modern science. It was a cruel paradox. The very institutions meant to preserve divine truth were also suffocating human discovery. Heresy and the Inquisition. When the Church felt its grip loosening, it struck back. The Inquisition, a network of clerical courts, was established to root out heresy and impurity within its own ranks. Monks were both the investigators and the accused. Those suspected of forbidden knowledge, hidden texts, or unorthodox visions were interrogated, sometimes tortured, until they confessed. Many confessions, of course, were forced. A single misunderstood dream or a passage copied from a pagan philosopher could mean imprisonment, exile, or death. And yet, even under threat, whispers of resistance survived. Secret fraternities of monks, devoted to knowledge, not dogma, began circulating coded writings across Europe. They disguised their studies of anatomy and astronomy as theological meditations. These men believed that truth could not contradict God, that to explore the universe was to honor creation itself. It was a revolutionary idea, and it would plant the seeds for what we now call the Renaissance, the collapse of faith and the rise of reason. By the 15th century, Europe stood on the brink of change. The printing press had been invented. Books, once chained to monastery walls, began to spread freely. Suddenly, the Bible could be read by anyone, not just the clergy. And with literacy came questioning. The Reformation exploded across Europe. Martin Luther, himself once an Augustinian monk, nailed his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Church, a symbolic act that shattered the power of the monasteries forever. Across the continent, monasteries were abandoned, looted, or repurposed. Some became schools, hospitals, even prisons. The age of unquestioned faith was ending. And yet, even as their physical walls fell, the psychological legacy of monastic life endured, the belief that isolation and discipline could lead to enlightenment, that control over the body could awaken the spirit. These ideas did not vanish. They transformed, resurfacing centuries later in new forms. In scientific laboratories, in spiritual retreats, even in the modern obsession with self-discipline and detoxing the soul. The monastery's ghost still lingers, in every philosophy that says you must suffer to transcend. A mirror to human nature. Looking back, it's easy to condemn the monks as fanatics. But perhaps the truth is more complicated. They lived in a world without antibiotics, without psychology, without the safety net of modern life. To them, suffering wasn't meaningless. It was the only thing that made sense. Every whip, every prayer, every sleepless vigil was a way to wrestle with the same questions we still ask today. Why do we suffer? What is the meaning of existence? And how far are we willing to go to touch the divine? The monasteries may have fallen into ruin, but their story is not just one of darkness. It is a reflection of humanity's greatest weakness and greatest strength, our endless hunger to find meaning in the mystery of life. But what can these ancient practices teach us today? Are there lessons buried beneath the madness? In the next chapter, we'll explore what the twisted world of medieval monasticism reveals about our own search for purpose, in a modern age that has forgotten the sacred. Centuries have passed since monks walked these halls. The incense has faded, the prayers have fallen silent, and yet, something of them remains. Their world of silence, devotion, and sacrifice might seem alien to us now, but the deeper we look, the more we see echoes of those same instincts within ourselves. Because beneath the twisted rituals, the self-punishment, the search for purity, lay something universal, the desperate human need to find meaning. The eternal search for control. In the medieval monastery, every moment of life was dictated. When to wake, when to pray, when to eat, when to sleep. It was a world of total structure. Every desire, every emotion was measured against a single question. Does this bring me closer to God? Today, we live in a world that worships freedom. We can choose what to wear, what to eat, whom to love. But that freedom, too, has its weight. And so we invent our own modern monastic rituals. We fast in the name of health. We meditate for clarity. We disconnect from technology to purify our minds. We even punish ourselves with guilt, comparison, or burnout, believing that struggle will somehow make us worthy. Different centuries, different gods, but the same human pattern repeats. The body becomes a battlefield for the soul. The psychology of purity and perfection. The monks believed that purity came from denying the self, that the holiest person was the one who could silence every desire. But desire, psychologists now know, doesn't disappear when you repress it. It festers. It returns in darker, more destructive forms. In that sense, many monastic sins were not moral failings. They were psychological inevitabilities. When we try to be perfect, to erase all weakness, to conquer every emotion, we often end up becoming the very thing we fear. Just as some monks descended into obsession or madness, modern society too suffers under the weight of its ideals. We chase impossible images of success, beauty, enlightenment, forgetting that to be human is to be imperfect. The monasteries remind us, purity without compassion becomes cruelty. Discipline without empathy becomes tyranny, and faith without self-understanding becomes fanaticism. Isolation and the human mind. Monks believed solitude brought them closer to God, and in some cases it did. Moments of silence can reveal truths that noise cannot. But isolation is a double-edged sword. Too much of it, and the mind turns inward, creating its own illusions, its own demons. In today's world, we've recreated this paradox in digital form. Millions of people live connected, yet deeply alone. We scroll through endless feeds, each image, each headline, another echo in the silent cloister of our minds. Perhaps the monks' visions of angels and demons weren't so different from the hallucinations we create today, except ours glow from screens instead of candles. Both are born from the same hunger, the need to make sense of loneliness, to give shape to the void. Pain as transformation. There's something undeniably powerful about the human relationship with pain. From the flagellants of the Middle Ages to modern athletes, soldiers, and artists, pain has always been a threshold. For the monks, pain wasn't just punishment. It was transformation. In their suffering, they believed they touched the divine, that endurance revealed truth. And though their methods were extreme, their insight wasn't entirely wrong. Pain can be a teacher. It shows us our limits. It humbles our pride. It reminds us we're alive. But the lesson the monks never learned, and one we still struggle with, is that pain alone is not meaning. It's only when suffering is paired with understanding that it becomes wisdom. Hidden knowledge and the modern mind. The monks' secret studies, their pursuit of forbidden knowledge, mirror our own age of curiosity. They risked everything to preserve ancient wisdom. And because of them, we still read Aristotle, Plato, and Galen today. Their story is a reminder that progress often begins in the shadows. That the ones called heretics are sometimes the ones carrying humanity forward. In a sense, the monasteries were the first laboratories, where faith and science collided, and knowledge was both feared and worshipped. Their paradox lives on in us. We still stand between mystery and reason, belief and doubt. We build machines to explain the universe, yet still kneel before questions we cannot answer. What do we keep, and what do we let go? If the monasteries represent humanity's attempt to control chaos, then their ruins remind us of what happens when control becomes obsession. We need boundaries, structure, and meaning. But when rules turn into cages, when discipline turns into punishment, we lose what made us human in the first place. The monks built walls to separate themselves from the world, but in doing so, they also cut themselves off from life, from laughter, from love, from the very humanity they sought to purify. Maybe that's the greatest lesson buried in these ruins. That enlightenment doesn't come from escaping the world, but from engaging with it. The modern monk within us. Even now, the spirit of the monastery lingers in subtle ways. In every self-help book that tells you to master your mind, in every silent retreat, in every person who believes that stillness can lead to awakening. We all carry a fragment of the monk within us, the seeker, the dreamer, the ascetic who wants to rise above the noise. But perhaps the true evolution of that spirit lies not in rejecting the world, but in transforming how we live within it, to live consciously, to suffer meaningfully, to seek truth without losing compassion. The twisted practices of medieval monasteries were born from the same fire that still burns within humanity, our hunger to be more than flesh and bone, to find order in chaos, to make the invisible real. We no longer build stone walls to contain our faith, but the battle between spirit and flesh, between reason and mystery, continues, now fought inside the human mind. And maybe that's what evolution truly means, not escaping our nature, but learning to understand it, from stone to spirit, from silence to understanding. The monastery still stands, not in the mountains of Europe, but in each of us. For centuries, the monasteries of medieval Europe stood as sanctuaries of prayer and prisons of the soul. They were born from faith, shaped by fear, and ultimately undone by the very humanity they tried to transcend. Behind their walls, people searched for purity, enlightenment, and truth, but also wrestled with loneliness, obsession, and madness. And maybe that is the paradox of all human progress. Every attempt to escape our darkness brings us face to face with it. The legacy of faith and flesh. From the silence of the cloister to the cries of the flagellants, the story of medieval monasticism is a mirror of our own contradictions. We seek meaning but fear mystery. We long for peace but can't stop striving. We build systems, whether of religion, science, or ideology, to make sense of life's chaos. And yet, each one eventually becomes a cage of its own design. The monks believed that by renouncing the world, they could rise above it. But perhaps the true path to enlightenment was never through denial, but through understanding, through accepting that the divine and the human, the sacred and the flawed, are not enemies, but reflections of one another. When we study the twisted practices of medieval monasteries, we are not just studying history, we are studying ourselves, the impulse to control what we don't understand, to punish ourselves for being imperfect, to turn mystery into rule and rule into ritual. It still lives within us, in every ideology that demands purity, in every system that claims to save humanity by suppressing it. A reflection beyond time. Perhaps that is why the ruins of those monasteries feel so hauntingly alive. They are more than relics. They are reminders. Reminders that every era, no matter how advanced, faces the same questions. What is the meaning of suffering? Where does faith end and fanaticism begin? And how far will we go to touch something greater than ourselves? The answers are never simple, because they aren't meant to be. They change with time, as humanity itself evolves. And yet some truths remain constant. That wisdom requires compassion. That faith must walk hand in hand with reason. And that enlightenment, whether through religion or science, must always begin with humility. So the next time you see the ruins of an old abbey or the faint carvings of a forgotten monk's prayer, remember those stones are not dead. They are fragments of the long human story, a story of devotion, delusion, and discovery. From the caves of prehistoric shamans, to the monasteries of the Middle Ages, to the laboratories and digital temples of today, humanity's search for meaning continues. We are still the same species that knelt before the unknown, trembling, curious, and unrelentingly hopeful. The monasteries may have fallen silent, but the questions they asked still echo. What does it mean to be pure? What does it mean to be human? And what must we sacrifice to find peace? Thank you for joining this journey into the shadows of faith and history. If this story made you question, wonder, or reflect, then the spirit of discovery lives on in you. Like, share, and subscribe. And continue the search with us on the next chapter of humanity's forgotten past.